Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Perry, and I'm a member of the AFA graduate staff team for the 2020 virtual annual meeting. It is a pleasure to welcome you today to our session entitled Hazing, the History, the Law, Getting Unstuck, and Replacement Activities, which is presented by Michael Eilon, Hank Neuer, Dr. Jason Merriweather, and Jamie Silverston Wilson. To fully engage with the educational program, be sure to choose View Live Stream option on your Whova page, which will direct you to the full Zoom experience. In order for us to continue to improve the quality of educational offerings, we ask that you complete a quick evaluation at the end of the program. I will be sure to share the link towards the end of our time together. This session number is 404, and the core competency focus area is student safety. Please be sure to write the correct session number in your evaluations at the end. I will now turn this time over to the presenters.
Good afternoon. Today we are going to be talking about hazing prevention, and we have collected some incredible speakers here for you. Our first speaker is going to be Hank Neuer. Hank, of course, has been described as one of the nation's foremost authorities on hazing. So we are certainly blessed to have him and also as our mentor here with us today. Dr. Jason L Merriweather, he is the recent author of Dismantling Hazing in Greek Letter Organizations, recently published by NASPA. Jamie Devin Wilson, she's the coordinator of Fraternity and Sorority Life at the University of New Hampshire. And finally, myself, Michael Eilon, founder and CEO of Greek University. Welcome. And with that, we're going to start with Hank Neuer.
Good day, everyone. Hazing rituals are almost always exploitive, plus physically and/or emotionally damaging. Hazers often maintain their actions are done all in good fun. For more than a century, newspapers and judges and the general public tolerated and even encouraged the practice. Those of you dedicated to keeping students safe, shake your heads when a busted chapter or sports team continues to haze after a warning or even a punishment. What we are seeing when the illicit and even illegal actions continue in secrecy is caused by confirmation bias. This is important. By definition, confirmation bias occurs as individuals and groups distort contrary information from you advisors and their nationals and alums in a way that confirms their previously existing beliefs or biases. Hearing that hazing is harmful, hazers stubbornly cling to the belief that hazing is necessary to protect the status quo, to quote unquote toughen up individuals for their own good and the greater good of the group, and for reasons of their own such as unity that put them in deep denial. They ignore hard facts from researchers and historians that would otherwise persuade the average non-group outsider that hazing is wrong, such as 92 hazing deaths since 2000, at least one hazing death every year in American schools from 1959 to 2019, and at least 3 close calls in 2020, even with many schools operating virtually during the pandemic. 2 of those 3 were repeat offenders. Confirmation bias again. Next slide. Hazing is a European import brought to schools such as Harvard from across the pond by English scholars employed as tutors and teachers who themselves defended a hazing practice of servitude known as fagging. One of the most important advocates of hazing was Martin Luther at Wittenberg. In terms of the effect of educational institutions, the hazing most of interest today is the hazing that occurred in adult secret societies and civic societies, Masons, Oddfellows, Sons of Malta, and so on. While the Masons in many ways were a laudatory group, their quasi-religious initiations included buffoonery, cross-dressing, mechanical goat rides, and other hazing. In 1737, Daniel Reese, a man who wanted nothing more than to be a Freemason, was killed by thrown boiling liquid during a faked initiation in which he had to kiss the backsides of the pranksters. Freemason Benjamin Franklin's reputation was tarnished in the American Mercury newspaper when he admitted to laughing at the cruel prank instead of ordering the hazers to desist. I think of him as the ultimate bystander person. He had two opportunities to stop this and failed. Other hazing deaths occurred from 1890 to 2004 in the Royal Archmasons, multiple Elks Clubs, Sons of Malta, Catholic Young Men's Association, which I formerly belonged to, and the Loyal Order of Moose. Fatalities occurred to white and black initiates of adult secret societies. Not all initiation acts get called hazing by hazers. There are euphemisms, such as tests of fortitude, applied to late 19th, early 20th century class scraps between first-year students and sophomores, and tests of the heart, which is a prison term for initiations and the title of a recent scholarly article that I had published. The first fraternity hazing death occurred in 1873 at Cornell when a Kappa Alpha Society pledge named Mortimer Leggett, son of a famed Civil War general, was taken on a voluntary, quote unquote, walkabout in darkness without torches in Ithaca's often dangerous gorge country. One of the hazers is pictured there, who later became one of the most generous donors to Cornell. Essentially, Mortimer fell from the cliff, taking the two brothers with him, and he died at a hotel where the initiation banquet was supposed to be the same evening. Significantly, the next hazing death in a fraternity was the same chapter, same school, Cornell, and it was also a takeout into the country. This one was a drowning. Here is clear evidence then of the aforementioned confirmation bias. New students maintain a deadly ritual that already killed one initiate and seriously injured two sophomore members. Battle royals. Traditional battles between so-called freshmen and sophomores often involve savage toe-to-toe fights to gain possession of a class pennant or flag. These were dangerous because typically no side accepted restrictions, and unless there was a death, injury, or public outcry, no school regulations on hazing. In student publications and in the residence halls, freshmen and upperclassmen alike praised each other for pro-initiation taunts, offensiveness, brutality, all under the guise of school spirit. Then as now, these battle royals were dangerous with flailing fists and kicks of the combatants, but add the occasional presence of firearms, spirits, negligence, occasional sadists, and overenthusiasm, and tragedies regularly occurred. I think it's important to note that until the late 1920s, there were far more freshman-sophomore deaths than there were fraternity deaths. New student Francis Obenchain died while participating in an annual scrap pitting first-year students against upper-class students. He's pictured here. Important, the cause of death was covered up by the school physician, who listed it as a heart problem. The father had an independent autopsy and proved that his skull was crushed during the battle royal. Also important during the late 20s, to compare to today, the first anti-hazing activist who lost a son was Mrs. George Steinman's. Only two newspapers that I could find, one in Indiana, one in Illinois, even wrote anything about what she was trying to accomplish. In 1990, her son, the brother of the victim, wrote me to tell me how it had torn up his family. He had read it in this book, Broken Pledges, that I'd written. Unfortunate accidents. Initiation deaths that could have been prevented were for years euphemistically excused as unfortunate accidents by school administrators, campus police, and especially the participants themselves. One such was the death in 1919 of freshman Frank McCullough, who drowned when he tried swimming to shore after Colgate University sophomores dumped him and abandoned him on an island. They left him with the expectation that he would swim to safety, and he drowned. Over enthusiasm on his part and on the parts of his classmates caused this tragedy. A number of upperclassmen over the years have also died in so-called accidents. Northwestern University's first-year student, Louis Aubert, was accidentally killed by a passing car while on the running board of a car as they searched for fellow freshmen abducted by sophomores. This was so close to what we all have seen in the movie Dazed and Confused many years later. Eileen Stevens, mother of an Alfred University local fraternity chapter pledge, who died from an alcohol overdose after being locked in a car and coerced into playing drinking games, was the first activist to condemn the term unfortunate accidents during a media campaign against hazing that lasted more than a quarter century, 1978 to 2004. And I think what's also important is that Alfred University, under Dr. Norm Pollard, was the first to do two very important national hazing surveys. The next slide depicts University of Texas football player Nolt Mcelroy. Now we're into the late 20s, and now fraternity deaths outnumber the freshman sophomore deaths. He was initiated into Delta Kappa Epsilon during the football season. Like fellow pledges, he crawled over bed springs charged with electricity. Unlike his fellow pledges, he died a sad and lamentable death. The school response was to be expected. Quote, "It simply was a terrible accident that could not have been foreseen," Texas Dean V.L. Moore told a reporter. And thankfully, today, many more administrators are 100% candid when describing events after a tragedy. The University of Texas now is one of the schools that contains all of the fraternity offenses on their site with complete transparency. Equal opportunity tragedy. Over the years, particularly since 1970, hazing deaths have claimed initiates of most ethnicities. This is Michael Davis in Missouri. Black, Hispanic, white, and Asian. Kappa Alpha Psi candidate for initiation Michael Davis was beaten to death in 1994 by members and passed out while in the backseat of an automobile as members ordered Taco Bell. Several members served small sentences. University of Texas Lambda Phi Epsilon pledge Fanta Jack Fumaruth died of acute alcohol intoxication during a fraternity event. Toxicology rulings came to over 4.0. It was their direct cause of death. I call this section Drink Up Pledge. Ever since the 1960s, most students of hazing and fraternity life have suspected alcohol was the major cause of hazing deaths. And before that time, it was uncertain whether alcohol was a factor at all. This young man is an entire chapter in my book coming out next year, Hazing in American Culture. In 1940 at the University of Missouri, pledge Hugo Spake Jr. of Theta Nu Epsilon and Kappa Sigma died by smothering following a drinking session mandated by a fraternity chapter unrecognized by the university. And as you all know, the unrecognized chapters are a real problem to this day. He likely was the first of many fraternity pledges to die from alcohol intoxication during an initiation. What is kind of interesting is that his main hazer, who was very contrite, very upset, later became a professional football player, quite well known. Since 2000, the great majority of hazing deaths have had alcohol, mainly supplied by the chapter or alumni, and even as I've researched, parents as a hazing death factor. Next section, what could go wrong? As is commonly agreed, not a single college hazing death was intentional, but risky activities inevitably lead to tragedies. Once upon a time, Greek advisors and activists ruminated on whether a hazing death could be a big H or little h hazing. Dan Bureau of the AFA led the charge 2005 to 2011, quote, toward a unified movement to end hazing. As it often turns out, what fraternity chapter members think could be a small hazing turns out to be a debacle and a tragedy and a very big H. The deaths with callous barbarity show broken pledges. Timothy Piazza of Penn State of Beta Theta Pi and LSU's Max Groover of Phi Delta Theta more than convinces anyone that once hazing commences, anything that could go wrong can and does go wrong. When hazing begins, empathy and a sense of justice runs out the door. A couple that I wanted to mention: 1998, reverse hazing or pledge sneaks at Texas. Member Greg Scott Phillips, Delta Tau Delta, fell from a cliff while trying to escape pledges, intent on throwing him fully clothed into a swimming pool. This one I think was important. University of Vermont, a Sigma Phi Society rush party. This is one I wrote about extensively and dealt with the father and grandfather. A 17-year-old named Jonathan McNamara fell from a cliff while on an outing with members of the chapter he wished to pledge. Alcohol was present and a factor, but unknown if it was a primary cause of accident. Why I think this is important compared to the Piazzas, Leon Kowiak, and others, the father and grandfather started off as major activists, but burned out on it. It's very, very tough on the parents, as you know. What you're seeing here, what could go wrong, that's a University of North Carolina soccer hazing, where traditionally they were to drink a gallon of beer from a pretzel container. Now they had a player from Russia, and in honor of my country, they were to drink vodka out of that pretzel barrel. One died, and a Dutch player almost died in a Wendy's. The next part is brutality and violence. I want to discuss, this is the Baruch Death Delta Psi Pledge, John Mike Deng. And if you may be familiar, when I was a graduate student at the University of Nevada, John Davies of the Sundowners, mainly a football chapter, died. Both of these were horribly pummeled during hazing. And I think that has not been studied enough. The idea that not only will people be humiliated, but beaten with it. Okay, coming near the end here, where we are today. In February 2018, there was a meeting of parents, and I was fortunate enough to be the keynote speaker at this very emotional meeting. My wife had not known much about hazing and attended to take photos. It was an extremely emotional event for us with the champions, the Piazzas, and many, many more. And so this is critical, I think, that parents have been so taken and are working with the fraternities and the schools to try to end it. Unfortunately, the parents have gone in different directions, mainly over how much to get involved with fraternities, but all are unified in wanting to abandon hazing. And this is a major part of the new book that I'm working on. On the bad side, close calls continue. Ungoverned chapters continue to infest campuses. A number of individual websites poke fun at hazing activism. Also bad, I have worked with lawmakers in Alaska, Wyoming, Indiana, and they have either not gotten a law or not had an improved law. What you're seeing here, the family of Colin Weant, who's just had passed in the Ohio House Collins Law just over 2 years after Weant's death. Collins Law, formerly called the Enact Anti-Bullying and Hazing Act, widens the definition and increases the penalties for hazing. I'd like to thank you for your kind attention. As Dave Westall says, the JV will now make room for the varsity speakers. And to the parents that may be watching this, your loss is all of our loss. Thank you.
Next up is Dr. Jason L Merriweather.
Hank, I am grateful to you for starting this conversation. I want to share your acknowledgement of parents and families who have lost students through the senseless and ridiculous violence caused by hazing. And I hope that this conversation helps create a better world and a better set of universities that helps to undo the harm so that no one else has to share in that suffering. In this aspect of the conversation, I want to do a little bit to outline issues of the law and issues of legal precedent. I start out reminding you that there are 44 states where hazing is either a felony or a misdemeanor. You can see if your state is there, you're one of the 6 states who is not there. I certainly encourage you to be active in encouraging leadership that there is encouraging leadership in the state legislature to address that issue. Moving on into conversation around case law, I want to share with you 6 cases. The first 3 will be instances of university liability. We call this sort of how to lose. So we start with Noel versus the Board of Regents in the University of Nebraska in 1999. A member of Phi Gamma Delta kidnapped and handcuffed and brutalized a pledge, taking them upstairs to what I believe is the 3rd floor window, handcuffing them to the window. The fraternity pledge got loose, fell 3 stories and suffered severe injuries out of the residence hall window. The victim sued, claiming negligence by the university for failure to enforce hazing and alcohol policies. In the lower court, the case was summarily dismissed. However, as always, there's the appeal. And in the appeal, which is discussed on the next slide, in the appeal, there was discussion of the issues at hand that the court said the university was in fact liable. And there were 3 particular factors. First of all, there was previous knowledge of campus hazing. So that means that any organization, be it another fraternity, sorority, student organization, or athletic organization, had some hazing take place. And then from there, that leads us to think about knowledge of incidents involving the specific fraternity that was involved in this lawsuit. So particularly for new members or new advisors or new professionals in fraternity and sorority life on your campuses, I really encourage you to make sure that you have full and robust access to records. Often, fraternity and sorority life professionals are challenged when records are either anecdotal or non-existent. But because of this issue of reasonable foresight, which was established by the court in this case, by the Federal Appellate Court, there was a clear delineation that if your organization or any organization has had an history of hazing, your liability has just gone up. And for those of you who are new, I encourage you to think about that, have those conversations with your directors, your vice presidents, or other historians on campus to clarify what exists. And often courts usually will look at least 10 to 20 years in terms of the scale of that reasonable foresight. The next case to consider is Kenner versus Kappa Alpha Psi. And for every advisor of a chapter who is in this space, I encourage you to go into the chat box and just do a wave or drop an emoji so we know who you are. And this case is for you. At the University of Pittsburgh, this case was resolved in 2002, where a student was pledging Kappa and was paddled over 200 times, followed by a 3-week hospital stay with complete renal failure, seizures, and hypertension. The student also currently still deals with the distress of PTSD. There was a lawsuit against Kappa, the local chapter, and multiple members of the university staff. In this case at the University of Pittsburgh, the lower and appellate court ruled in favor of the defendants, with the exception of who? The advisor. It was based on 2 points. The individual advisor had failed to have focused discussions with the chapter about hazing. That means that the days where the advisor simply has a job to sign off on paperwork for a party or for an event are long gone. And it's really important that we address that. The second issue was that the advisor did not individually advise reading of executive orders from the organization and sanctions associated with hazing by the university. So it's really important that we have a standard for educating our advisors. Next is the case of Florida versus Dante Martin, which of course is the death of Robert Champion, as my colleague Hank Neuer mentioned earlier. In the Champion case, it's important to understand that at 26 years old, Robert Champion is the victim that we talk about because of his untimely and unfortunate and unnecessary death. But there were actually multiple victims on the bus that night who had to go through and be hit with instruments and fists on the way to the back of the bus. Oftentimes in cases like this, what happens is attorneys will say, hey, I'm going to file a bunch of stuff, and sort of like throwing spaghetti at the wall, and let's see what sticks. So the first thing that the attorneys for Dante Martin and the co-defendants did was to try to throw out the history of hazing and the history of hazing both within the band and at the university. And they tried to render those inadmissible, but the court decided that they were indeed admissible. This goes back to the issue of reasonable foresight that I discussed in the earlier case. With that in mind, the sexual orientation of Robert Champion, who was gay, was mutually decided by the defense and prosecution, or mutually agreed upon not to be a factor in the trial. Tell me why. Anyone, please jump in the chat box, and I'd love to hear your perspective in the chat box on why it was important to remove Robert Champion's sexual orientation from the case for both the defense and the prosecution. As I give you a second to do that, and I see a couple of people chiming in, I'll share with you, thank you for your comments, I'll share with you that in fact, it was because they wanted to avoid federal prosecution for a hate crime. Thank you. And I saw Spencer, you were the first one to come across my scene and say hate crime, although I see a couple others are saying it too. Thank you, Will, from Ohio State as well. I appreciate that. And so essentially they were trying to avoid that as a part of this case. And then the third motion was challenging the constitutionality of Florida as a state having anti-hazing law. And of course, that was also denied. And so those are some important issues to consider. I now want to share a little bit for universities in terms of examples of how universities have gotten on the other side of hazing cases by having some of the right things in place. First, Rabel v. Illinois Wesleyan, although this isn't necessarily a hazing case, it is a seminal case in terms of liability and understanding the duty of care for universities. So an on-campus resident was working at the front desk of her residence hall. She weighed about 120 pounds, and a 250-pound fraternity member grabbed her from behind the desk, threw her over his shoulder, took off running, fell, landed on her head. He caused hearing loss, loss of sense of smell, and eventually some issues with memory. The victim sued the university, the fraternity, and the fraternity member who caused injury in state court for civil damages. The student essentially claimed that the university was negligent and should have liability to have protected her and other residents. The results of this case really built off of, as you'll see in the next slide, off of the standards set in the 1986 Beach versus University of Utah case, which also wasn't a hazing case, but it is really critical to hazing, the framework for hazing precedent. So the finding was in favor of the university at both the state and appellate levels. And on the appeal, the court stated the following. This is really important. Universities are educational rather than non-custodial institutions, and requiring the university to babysit each student would be wholly inappropriate. Further noting that students are now considered adults and not under university control. This means there was not a duty to protect against the drunk fraternity member. This framework of protection for the universities really says it's all about the standard for education. The university can't necessarily follow a student around to monitor their actions, but the university is in fact required and compelled to provide reasonable and substantive education. I'll give you an example in the next case. In this case, we see Texas A&M University in the Alton versus Hopgood case. Members of the Texas A&M Corps of Cadets were subjected to hazing, beatings, and torture by student drill team members and advisors. Upon report, all student advisors responsible for the hazing were immediately expelled or suspended by Texas A&M. In the complaint and appeal, the Corps of Cadets and university officials were granted immunity from the lawsuit because they had conducted reasonable education and they had explored not only thou shalt not haze, but they actually went into the dangers and risk of hazing in a few ways. They disseminated brochures and lots of preventative materials for students. They met with students and parents. And this is really critical and really important for us to consider. That conversation during orientation is absolutely necessary and one of the key things I discussed with campus leaders. And then from there, they had a clear process for reporting hazing concerns that was clear and available to all students. Similarly to my colleague, when we did our planning for this, you can go to the next slide, or you can stay on this slide, the Lloyd versus Alpha Phi Alpha slide. Thanks, Mike. When we talked last night, Hank mentioned to me and suggested that I mention the case of Gary DiVercelli at Rider University. And this case is about 13 years old. But in the lawsuit, one of the things that the family sued for wasn't just, obviously, they wouldn't get their son back with money, but they sued the university to change and have much more clear policies and educative activities for hazing. And that's really important. And as you look at organizations like PUSH, Parents United to Stop Hazing. And if you look at a lot of the work that's happening, it really is encouraging and trying to move universities into taking a proactive and less reactive stance to fraternity and sorority hazing. That takes us to a case involving my own fraternity. I couldn't do this and skip out on my own fraternity. Lloyd versus Alpha Phi Alpha. Sylvester Lloyd was a transfer student and an athlete at Cornell University. He was beaten and endured torture and psychological abuse and embarrassment. He was sued for negligent supervision. They sued the university for negligent supervision, premises liability, and again, in breach of implied duty to protect the student. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that again, the university was on 4 points found not liable in this case. Number one, the university had a clear, published, prohibitive policy about hazing. But they didn't just stop at the policy. They had published and advertised, again, the specific risks and dangers of hazing. Having an actual conversation and an educative process for discussing hazing beyond doubt shalt not. Accordingly, there was no special relationship or implied contract between the university and the student. We couldn't stop you from hazing, but we could educate you about it. And the university never promised we could protect you, but we are required to educate you. And again, back to that issue of reasonable foresight, this chapter had never been in trouble before, so there wasn't a sufficient reason to believe that hazing activities were going on. And once the university became aware, it quickly took disciplinary action and again, what? Followed its own policy. So what's really critical to this conversation really sort of moves us into what we introduce in the book, this Merriweather prevention education model. I actually framed this for my dissertation and offer it in the book, Dismantling Hazing in Greek Letter Organizations, as a tool for organizations to use both at the chapter level, at the university level, and in congruence and in partnership with national organizations. We have a pre-membership education model and a post-membership education model that compels new student and parent program education, as we talked about, engaging regional, national Greek letter organization officers well before something happens. Our first conversation with nationals should not be after someone is hurt or in trouble. Having a clear certification for advisor training, where advisors are gone in and taught how to be advisors. Even long-term advisors sometimes need to be refined and retaught how to be advisors, and especially our faculty and staff advisors. And then having an educative policy session where state, organizational, and university regulations are all covered for aspiring and current members prior to any membership intake or rush. And then on the back end, having a similar set, although in a slightly different order, different set of standards for engaging, again, the national and regional GL officers. Obviously for NPHC organizations, there's a considerable deal more focus on working with local grad chapters, while often for NPHC or for NPC or IFC, or even sometimes different multicultural organizations, there's a vast different model for how that works. So it's really important to have those folks engaged as partners. And then having a clear Greek council that focuses on peer education to hold higher standards for accountability for hazing. Again, having advisor involved preventative education. Advisors shouldn't just show up again when it's time for the party. And then again, having an educative policy session at the end for people who are in, along with a lot of universities are doing this, where the aspirants, the aspiring members, and the current members have to have sessions together about hazing. In my last 20 seconds, I want to say that I know Dr. Chuck Eberly is in this group at Eastern Illinois, faculty emeritus there, one of the good friends and one of the original researchers in hazing. His work goes a long way back, so shout out to Dr. Eberly. And I also saw Emily Fuhr, who contributed to my book, and we're glad to have you in this space as well. I now get to introduce the awesome, phenomenal Jamie, who's going to come in and take us home with some great recommendations. I turn it over to you, Jamie Devin Wilson.
Thank you so much, Jason and Hank, for doing a great job setting up the history and the law when it comes to hazing. If you're tuning in today, or if you're going to be watching the recording, I thank you for taking the time out of your day, out of your AFA annual meeting to be with us today. I know sometimes choosing the hazing conversation takes a little bit more than choosing some of the other types of programming, since we talk about hazing quite often, but I do believe that the perspective we're bringing today hopefully will bring some takeaways to your campus, your headquarters, or your community. So we're going to talk about getting unstuck. And so when you all read the little program description, most likely you were like, what does that even mean? But I know as a fraternity and sorority life professional working at the University of New Hampshire, and also as a speaker who speaks across the country, but mostly virtually right now, being an advisor at any capacity, whether you're at the headquarters level, at a volunteer level, or at the campus level, it's hard. And sometimes we're getting such different competing information when it comes to policy, procedure, laws, the history, the data that you have collected, that you get stuck in a rut. And you might be doing the same programming over and over again. And I know for me, summer normally, maybe during COVID times it looked a little bit different, could be a time to revamp, connect with other people across the country, and really take a look at how to become unstuck. A big piece of this is asking the question of our students, how can I help you? I do this a lot, and some of my colleagues that I see on the call do this a lot as well. I can't remember exactly where I got this from, but we need to start with the question, how can I help you? Whether that is talking to our students, whether that is talking to our parents, whether that's talking to our campus or our headquarter partners. I want everybody to take a moment and think about the last time somebody asked you that question. And I'm going to ask you right now to be a little bit reflective. So I'd love for you all in the chat to post your intention for today. How can I help you? What is your intention of what you would like out of this program today? And I'm going to give you all a couple of minutes to engage in the chat and share those intentions. And while you're throwing those in the chat, Mike is monitoring it. I'm going to keep going for time's sake, but I hope that you'll engage with me for a moment and share with your colleagues on the call that intention. The how can I help you piece moves so much further into our conversations on hazing prevention, how to get unstuck within hazing. Our students in Generation Z, more often than not, are looking for our guidance. They are looking for connection. They are looking for belonging. And I know those are words that we all use every single day, and we normally use them in terms of recruitment. But right now, when I'm thinking about getting unstuck, it's how do we, as the people that are helping our students move forward, move the needle forward, and ultimately hope to end hazing so that we have no more history, we are encouraging you all to think about these 3 next steps. And so the first step I have for you all is taking a deep look of the understanding of laws, history, and policies where you work. And so this might be obvious to some of you, but some of you might be new to the field, or a new professional or a graduate student. And I think where we all need to start is what has happened first, before we entered our roles, before we started working one-on-one with a student or an organization, because we need to set a framework for our learning, for our programs, and for true harm prevention work. The next piece is active listening. I'm sorry, I'm trying to click the thing. There we go. Okay, and it's leading with a strong sense of number 1 with a lot of active listening. I say this because when we're talking about moving the needle and doing true harm prevention work, this has to do with the conversations and not just your programming. I know that we all do our programming for hazing prevention, or we should be. We are having different modules that are virtual right now for our students to go through, whether we're at the campus or headquarters or vendor level. But at the end of the day, our one-off conversations are so important in creating harm reduction from a public health perspective. We want to include active listening in our conversations to hear the words that our students are saying when they're truly asking for help. And we might not know it unless we're actively listening during these conversations. The third piece, I'm not going to get into yet because I want to share the perspective that I'm coming from. Hazing is trauma. And I don't know if anybody's ever thought of that perspective before, but when I speak on college campuses or virtually about hazing, I'm also talking about sexual violence and how we use bystander intervention in our approaches to both. When we're thinking about bystander intervention, when we're thinking about trauma, and when we're thinking about how to get unstuck in our advising, our programs, and our policy, it's really thinking about the procedures and those everyday little moments that happen to engage, uplift, and move the needle forward. And one of those pieces is understanding traumatic response. And a lot of people probably have seen this type of graphic before. They're very negative words, right? Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. When we think of these things, we think of these actions as bullies or narcissistic behaviors or being codependent or just disassociating. And being able to recognize the traumatic responses in our students could be the first step to our active listening so we can have healthy conversations to build assessment-driven programs on our campuses. Another piece of traumatic response is understanding the positives. The fact that there will be some leaders in your organizations that choose to be triggered in a different way to trauma, meaning they might see themselves as the change makers. And I know that we have some experts on this call. Other people presenting with me are so much more experts than I am, and I'm honored to be speaking with them today. But understanding that if you have a leader in your room, you have the opportunity to ask questions, to listen, and to hear their assertiveness, their courage, their mindfulness in how they choose to speak and talk to you about hazing. I think this is one of the best ways that when we work with our students, we can utilize their own experiences into transforming those experiences into ending hazing. By using our students to move the needle, we are enabling ourselves to be more creative in our programs in the future. We are utilizing assessment and data-driven tactics by coding some of those themes that we have in our conversations after in order to move that needle. And I think one of the last things I'm going to say about getting unstuck when it comes to traumatic response is that if you're working with students in your councils, your community, one-on-one, it's truly not just about the new member education. It's truly about meeting each student where they're at when you have simple conversations in passing. And I know those conversations are hard to come by right now with a lot of us being remote or hybrid models, but finding the time to listen and finding the time to really hear what our students are saying so that we can empower them to end hazing in their chapters, in their communities, or in their councils. The third piece is focus on empathy and accountability. I feel like you probably all were thinking this entire time, well, she's not coming up with programming ideas, she's not coming out with the action plan, and she's most definitely not talking about the everyday things that we hear about harm prevention or risk reduction when it comes to hazing. And that's because I truly believe to build a hazing prevention model on your campus, in your headquarters, your communities, and the chapters that you're working with, we need to focus on empathy first. We need to create spaces where they can come to you to ask for help, where they feel like they can sit down and say, hey, Jamie, I'm ready to create that action plan. And I know it's going to be really hard, but I know that if you are in my corner, if my headquarters is in my corner, if my other leaders are in my corner, that I'm going to be able to do it. And I know some of you are probably rolling your eyes right now, because that's really hard to get students to come to the level of wanting to make change. But if we continuously create environments where they feel comfortable and build trust, they might feel like they have to hold their chapter members accountable. And ultimately, that's your third piece here, accountability. How are we creating accountable conversations in everything that we do? Helping our students understand that after they haze, there is no tolerance, that this is horrifying trauma that is happening to our students on our campuses, and that we will not tolerate it. But if you choose to come to us, if you choose to work with us, and if you choose to be the change maker, then that accountability is coming from our students. That means we can move the needle. And that means we could then work on that action planning. And I know that we have campus professionals, vendors, and headquarters professionals on this call. We have some parents on this call. We have some experts on this call. But understanding that that last piece of how are we choosing to hold them accountable should not come before empathy, should not come before learning and unlearning. It needs to come after. And it needs to be a precedent that they will be held accountable to their actions. And a piece of that is understanding new member development and new member education, and how to create activities that truly work in a virtual and a non-virtual environment. So I don't believe I moved my slides forward. I want to share with you these 3 empathetic responses: cognitive, compassionate, and emotional. Take a quick look. You all can read. I'd love for you to share in the chat box right now, what do you think we all lead with when talking about hazing, when we are thinking about it from an empathetic response to trauma? Are we using our cognitive abilities, our compassionate abilities, or our emotional abilities? And if you want to throw that all in the chat right now, I'd love to hear those responses. Hopefully I didn't put you asleep. So ultimately, if you practice 1 through 3, then you can move forward to that accountability and action. Thank you. Compassionate. Thanks, Spencer. Compassionate. Lee, interesting. Cognitive. Lily, cognitive. So when I was doing that research, the majority of therapists in particular talk about empathy in the compassionate. We choose to do our empathetic responses compassionately. And I believe that we need to be integrating all forms of empathy in our advising, no matter what platform you have to work with our students, that we're integrating a little bit of everything. So thank you so much for sharing some of those responses in the chat. And when you take accountability and action, you're ultimately moving forward. So we're ultimately moving forward to create a framework so that way Mike, our next presenter, can talk to you about those replacement activities, that accountability. How can we move forward and create action plans that truly work for our fraternities and our sororities on our campus so that we can move away from hazing? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Hank. Thank you, Dr. Merriweather. Thank you, Jamie, for all of your work. You guys are all rock stars. I remember in-person speaking events just like this, giving high fives to the many students in the audience who get it and are part of the solution. And by the way, that should be campus-wide. That shouldn't be just FSL. And the students, as my colleague Jamie alluded to, the students should be free to seek help without fear of punishment. And so when I talk on stage about the spring of 1994, when I was hazed during initiation into my own fraternity, which turned the ritual, which of course should have been a beautiful thing, it turned it into something negative for me with hazing. And ultimately I had to spend a lot of time going through the ritual and understanding it until now, when I have a much greater appreciation for that ritual. But I also show the students how an 18-year-old freshman who cared very much about what the senior leaders in the chapter thought about him, I showed them how an 18-year-old freshman ended hazing in his own chapter by building allies, within the chapter before I had this heartfelt talk at a chapter meeting, and then creating substitute activities. So I showed them exactly how an 18-year-old was able to do that. It took a lot of courage, but I knew that it was critical for me as a person because of the values that I have, for the existence of our chapter and to protect our members and our guests, which is really the most important thing. And as my colleague Jamie said, I think we have to ask questions. How can I help you? It was spot on. So learn the goals of the students. Ask questions. What is the goal of this new member education process that you have here? Is it to get to know the other members, both the existing members and the new members? Is it to learn our history and our traditions within the organization? Is it to understand how the chapter operates and the roles of all of the members? Is it to help the new members learn how to use campus resources? Is it also to recruit new members who demonstrate the values of our organizations? And ultimately, it's our responsibility to help them be a part of the solution to create this positive new member education program. So the questions now become, what makes someone a good brother or sister in our chapter? What things do they need to learn in order to be effective? Are we causing any mental or physical harm to any of our new members? Has the chapter advisors or the campus advisors reviewed this new member education program? Have we told the new members what the requirements are for membership? Right? So we always get something before our class starts, a syllabus, to explain what is going to be coming up ahead. That should be part of fraternity and sorority life. That should be part of our business plan. And also, how can we hold old and new members accountable from straying from this program that we've designed together that could maybe somewhere down the line turn into hazing? And I know in the comments, I've been reading through some of the comments that you've been sharing, and I appreciate all of your participation here. Ultimately, the question is, how can we build relationships within a chapter without hazing? And so it's all about these replacement activities. So number one, review those goals with the new members, ask questions, and ultimately understand that we're going to have to meet the students where they are. So when I speak to students all over the country, they're always talking about unity. And of course, there's that differentiation between pledge class unity and chapter unity. So we want to be focused on the chapter unity portion. And certainly there is a need from the student's perspective of some sort of rites of passage, that they don't want to freely give their letters away, that somehow they feel that the new members would need to earn those letters in order to be a part of the organization. And so we have to understand where they're coming from and then ultimately satisfy those needs without hazing the new members, because there is a perceived lack of alternatives out there. So that is part of the issue. And ultimately, if we just take out that hazing event, whatever that hazing event looks like on your campus, if we just take that out with no replacement, another hazing activity is going to come in its place. So when we're thinking about replacement activities, and feel free in the chat, add some replacement activities that you've seen work on your particular campus. We would love to share some of those ideas in terms of what those replacement activities look like in your opinion. But I think what they are all going to share once we go and review them is they're going to be one of these particular pieces on this list. It could be common activities together as a chapter. It could be problem solving. It could be brotherhood and sisterhood. It could be leadership skills. It could be academics. It could be something having to do with the organization history or studying the ritual. It could be community or service learning. And then finally, that last piece of career mentoring, which is exactly what Gen Z is looking for. This is exactly what they want. So some examples that I've been able to institute in various chapters around the country: community service projects, fundraisers, having a ropes course outdoors, a chapter room or campus improvement project, planning events, developing a peer mentoring or shadowing program. This is so critical. Why should we wait for the new members to be ready to take leadership positions? If as part of their new member education process, they're shadowing the exec board, wonderful. We have ready-made leaders that are ready to go immediately. So this is really, really important. Positive PR, we're always looking for positive PR within fraternity and sorority life. Hosting council meetings, developing an alternative spring break program, perhaps getting to know faculty. So creating this session where we can have new members meeting with faculty. Hosting a family day, that's something that's very important. Inviting university experts to come in and help with test-taking skills, study methods, time management. Having an older member or an alumnus of the organization come in. Using career resources, senior recognition ceremonies, even going and walking the dogs at a local dog shelter. And now I know many of you, of course, we now have COVID, we have this pandemic, and we're looking for activities to promote chapter bonding virtually. So I want to address that component as well and give you some ideas of what our chapters are doing in a virtual environment. I have seen chapters start a book club where they all read a common book, and then on a Zoom, they're discussing how that applies to their chapter. There's lots of online certifications. Recently, we've been offering mental health first aid training to our clients. So that's something that can be done online. It is an 8-hour program, so I will warn on that. Invite community business leaders into online chapter meetings, have a financial advisor come in and talk about personal finance, hold group discussions. What do the organization values mean to all of the chapter members? And perhaps the new members, the people who are not in the fishbowl, can identify what those chapter weaknesses are and then brainstorm some solutions. Now, I did want to stop here and just give you an opportunity to ask our speakers some questions. So we have a couple of minutes. If you do have a question, feel free to throw that into the chat now, and we can certainly direct that to one of our speakers who are absolutely incredible to answer for you. Or you could also raise your hand and we can have somebody unmute you as well, whichever you feel most comfortable with. But I did want to at least provide you with a couple of minutes for time. Of course, if you want to contact us, this is the phone number, email address, website. We're on social media at Greek University, and there's a lot of free resources on our YouTube channel. So just go to youtube.com/Greek University Inc., and you'll find all kinds of interviews, all kinds of resources on hazing prevention. Some of these replacement activities that we're seeing here in the chat, walk the line activity, song activity, vulnerability. I think all of that is very good. Meredith is asking, have you had any opportunities to run assessments on those alternative activities or follow chapters over time as they've implemented the alternatives? Other questions from Lily, how does the conversation go when you're trying to get chapters to consider replacement activities? They are resistant to consider something because of their tradition. So these are all both very, very good questions. And what I would tell you is you have to get the alumni buy-in once you start to implement some of these alternative activities, because the alumni are typically used to a certain process for new member education. So the key that I found is when you're rebuilding this new member education process, to get the alumni buy-in on the front end, explain to them what the new process is going to be, and then of course follow them over time. So a lot of these replacement activities that we've implemented, they've been implemented over the last, I would say, probably year to 2 years. So we are seeing that they are continuing on. Those hazing activities have not returned. But the key is the alumni buy-in. If you don't have the alumni buy-in, it becomes very, very difficult to change these traditions that have lasted sometimes generations within a particular chapter. So it's important to make sure that the alumni are a big part of the solution, that you get their buy-in as well. And I think that's why they've been successful. I think that's why they've stuck. Any other questions? I know we have another minute or so. You're very welcome. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kelsey. So good to see you. Thank you, Molly. Great to see you as well. All right. So in the chat, there is the evaluation for session number 404. Please click on that and give the evaluation. That's really important for AFA to make sure that we have quality programs going forward. So we really appreciate all of you being here today. We encourage you to reach out to us, let us know how we can help, and we really appreciate your time for this very, very important discussion. That link again is in the chat box for the survey. It's really important that you fill that out. And thank you so much to all of our panelists, our speakers, rock stars.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Take care. Have a great AFA.